Now, brace yourself for the worst. That's the warning from researchers who say the worst of this year's Harmattan season, characterized by fine particles and suspended dust in the atmosphere, is yet to come. Data from air quality sensors show Accra's air is hazardous for all groups of people, claiming the unenviable title of having the world's worst air quality. IQ Air, an air quality monitoring center with more than a dozen sensors around the country, has ranked the air quality in Accra as the worst, ahead of Mumbai in India and Wuhan in China. Researchers believe the Harmattan will become more intense in the coming days. Analyst with Clean Air Fund, Victoria Usuteria, says the dust season is expected to peak in the coming days.
Okay, so for last year, based on meteorology, we normally get the dust coming in during the Harmattan season from the Sahara Desert, the northeast trade winds blowing in the dust into the country. Now, in February, when we had that spike, there was a dust storm raised over the Sahara that brought in higher concentrations of dust into the country and then hitting Accra. And Accra, from evidence or from research, there's been anthropogenic or man-made pollution sources as well. And so coupling that with the dust emanating from the Sahara caused that spikes in terms of pollution levels during February or during the Harmattan last year. Now, from research too, we found that during February we have or reached the peaks and the peak of the Harmattan. So mostly the dust levels, concentration levels are quite high in February. And then along the way, getting to the latter parts of February, it reduces. We get a mixture of dry and wet conditions, getting some few rains here and there, and so improving the quality of air, setting in the rainy season or the wet season.
Okay, so we are getting into February then.
Yeah.
Should we be expecting a similar spike, or we should be peaking at, say, our Harmattan period?
Yeah, so not a similar spike, I would say, but then during February, we will still be experiencing the hazy conditions we are experiencing now, which might, of course, increase, but not to that level that we experienced last year. From the first weeks of February to the middle part of the month. But however, like I said, getting to the latter parts of the month, we expect that conditions will improve, thereby improving the quality of air over Accra.
Now, the Ghana Meteorological Agency says although the intensity of the Harmattan season in previous years was more intense, this year's Harmattan has lasted longer than previous years. Joshua Asamoah is a senior meteorologist with the Ghana Meteorological Agency.
No, every season actually comes with its own intensity. You will never have two seasons being the same across the globe. That's how it has been. Even for rainfall, you have seasons coming with their own variabilities. So the intensity has not been the same, but we can say that in the past few years, we get very intense Harmattan in the south for a short period of time, and then generally we'll be getting occasional rainfall in between. But for the northern portions, you can see that the intensity will come and last for some time before it relaxes and all of that.
Yeah. Okay, so at the month of February, I'm told is the last stretch of it. Over the years, what was the trend? So is truly February the peak of it and the highest intense more of the Harmattan season?
The peak actually varies.
Okay.
So sometimes you can have the peak in January. There are times that you could even get it in December. But when we compare this year to that of last year, we can say we are getting the peak somewhere around late January into February. But in the northern portions, the peak was somewhere in December, and it was quite intense, very dry conditions. And even the cessation, when the Harmattan actually ends, it ends earlier in southern Ghana than the northern portions. So we'll be seeing the Harmattan coming to an end somewhere in February. And then late February into March, we'll start seeing some rains, bringing the onset of the rainfall season in the southern portions. But northern Ghana will still be in the Harmattan around that time.
Thankfully, Joshua Asamoah joins us via phone with more detail. Joshua, grateful for joining us. Now, over the weekend, the atmosphere was very hazy. What does that tell us about the Harmattan this year compared to that of previous years?
Well, thanks for having me. So we saw an intensification of the dusty conditions from the Sahel areas, and they were transported by low-level winds into our country. That's why we saw the dry, dusty conditions intensifying over the weekend. But when we compare this with the past years, we can say that this is not the highest we've seen. It's a very significant concentration of dust within the country around this time, but this is not the highest we've seen in recent years. I remember very well in 2016, we had very intense harmattan that caused flights to be cancelled at the Kotoka International Airport. And for international flights to be cancelled, it means that the dust concentration was very high, because these flights have landing aids that help them even when visibility is poor. And so for them to get cancelled within that period, that tells of the intensity of the dust around that time. In 2020 as well, we had a very significant increase in the harmattan, and that led to cancellation of local flights. In that instance, international flights were able to go. So it wasn't as deteriorating as the one that we saw in 2016. So even last year, even though the duration for the harmattan for Accra, for instance, was a bit shorter, but the intensity during that short period was quite high. So we will not say that this is the highest we've seen or the greatest intensity that we've seen in recent years. We've had worst case.
But at least it's a little prolonged than some years. So we want to find out, what's the cause for the prolonged harmattan this year?
Well, it's not really. It's not also the longest duration we've seen, but compared to just last year, we can see that this one has been a bit longer than the duration for last year. But most of the time, these duration and intensity are actually determined by the source region. The harmattan actually does not start from Ghana. It's a weather phenomenon that is happening in the Sahel areas. And so that area is a desert. The dust is already there. What it needs is for the winds and the atmospheric pressure to be favorable enough to raise them. Once it is raised in the Sahel areas, they are transported by the low-level winds that come from Northern Africa towards the Atlantic Ocean. When they are coming from these areas, the winds carry the characteristics of the land that they track over. Sudan, Chad, Northern Nigeria, Niger areas, these are all dry areas. So as the winds are tracking over them, they carry the dry, dusty conditions that are in these countries along with them. And so they deposit them into their country during December, January, February, and that brings our harmattan. And so when the intensity or the strength of the winds that are bringing these dry, dusty conditions are less, then harmattan will also be less intense in the country. But when you get very strong winds there, then they pick a lot of these dusty and dry conditions along with them. And so you get very intense harmattan also happening. So those are the dynamics that we see every year, which brings the differences in intensity of harmattan within the country.
So we can't say climate change has a role to play here.
Climate change may have a role, but I will not say that it is entirely because of climate change. Climate change in itself will probably affect the quality of the air that we are seeing, because outside the concentration of the dust, which will help in the destroying the air's quality, there's also the fumes from cars, emissions from industry that are also polluting the atmosphere. These things are more of human-induced activities that are enhancing these pollutants. And so climate change is just about greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so what we are doing as individuals, contributing to greenhouse gases, could be as a result of climate change enhancement. But for the dust itself, I would not really say that there's climate change. That is.
Okay. All right. Go for you.